What if everything you believe about belly fat is wrong? Not slightly wrong, but completely backwards. Because here's the part almost nobody talks about. In multiple gut microbiome studies, researchers found that people with stubborn belly fat often carry up to 2.5 times more fat-associated bacteria than people with similar diets and activity levels. And in controlled observations, when this internal balance shifts in the wrong direction, visceral fat can increase by 10 to 20% over time, even when calorie intake doesn't change. Let that sink in. Calories, stable. Exercise, consistent. Diet, clean. And yet the belly refuses to move. Now here's where it gets even more unsettling. In one long-term clinical case, a 66-year-old man followed a strict healthy diet for nearly 2 full years. No junk food, no sugar binges, daily walking, but his abdominal fat barely changed. His waist remained stubbornly distended, despite everything looking right on paper. Then researchers looked deeper. A gut microbiome analysis revealed something unexpected. His internal bacterial balance was heavily shifted toward inflammatory, fat-promoting strains, the kind linked in studies to disrupted metabolism and increased fat storage signaling. No one saw it coming, because from the outside, everything looked normal. But inside, the system was working against him. Then something changed. A simple daily protocol focused on gut support compounds was introduced. Nothing extreme, nothing pharmaceutical. Within just 4 weeks, the results shifted dramatically. Waist size reduced by about 3 inches. Bloating significantly decreased. Digestion normalized for the first time in years. And importantly, no other lifestyle variables were changed. No new workout plan. No calorie restriction overhaul. Just a shift in gut signaling. And this is where modern research is starting to point in a new direction. Because scientists are now identifying specific natural compounds that appear to influence gut bacterial balance, inflammation pathways, and metabolic signaling tied to fat storage. Some clinical findings report changes such as 15% reduction in bloating markers, up to 17% improvement in glucose regulation, measurable waist reductions in 8 to 12 weeks in controlled groups, not from extreme diets, but from consistent daily exposure to certain compounds. In this video, we break down exactly what those compounds are, and why researchers are paying closer attention to them than ever before. Starting with something most people completely underestimate. Number 6. Ground flaxseed. Most people hear this and think it's just extra fiber. Something basic. Something insignificant. But inside the body, it doesn't act basic at all. It acts like a small daily signal that slowly shifts how the gut behaves. In nutritional research following more than 120 participants over 12 weeks, daily flaxseed intake was associated with about a 15% improvement in bloating-related outcomes, along with measurable changes in gut microbial balance. Not dramatic weight changes, but consistent internal shifts. Now here's what's actually happening. When ground flaxseed enters the digestive system, it absorbs water and forms a gel-like structure. That gel doesn't just pass through. It changes the movement of food inside the gut. Everything slows down slightly, more controlled, more stable. And that alone affects how the body handles blood sugar after meals. Because slower digestion usually means fewer sudden glucose spikes. And glucose stability is closely tied to insulin response. And insulin is one of the key signals that determines whether energy is stored or used. But flaxseed is not only about that mechanism. It also contains plant-based omega-3s and lignin compounds. These have been studied in relation to gut barrier support and microbial balance. Some findings suggest around a 20% shift in inflammatory gut markers with consistent intake over time. And that connects to something important, because the gut is not isolated. When inflammation in the gut stays elevated, the body tends to adjust its overall metabolic behavior, often in subtle but meaningful ways. There is also the microbiome angle. Some studies report increases in beneficial bacteria like lactobacillus and bifidobacterium in the 20 to 30% range with regular intake. These are the same bacteria associated with smoother digestion and more stable internal metabolism. But here's the part most people overlook. Preparation. Whole flax seeds are often not broken down properly during digestion, so a large portion of the compounds never actually get used. That's why research typically focuses on ground flaxseed. And even then, timing and freshness matter, because once ground, it slowly loses potency. Hydration is also a key factor. Without enough water, the same fiber that supports digestion can feel heavy instead of helpful. So the real takeaway isn't that flaxseed is a miracle food. It's that number 6 creates a subtle but repeatable shift in the gut environment over time. And in systems like this, repetition matters more than intensity. But this is only the first layer, because number 5 moves beyond digestion and starts affecting how fast the entire system operates. Number 5. Ginger. At this point, things stop being just about digestion. Something deeper starts shifting in the background. Ginger has been analyzed in multiple human studies, including data from over 1,600 participants across several clinical trials. And across those studies, the pattern is surprisingly consistent. Small reductions in body weight, slight decreases in waist measurements, improved fasting glucose levels. Nothing dramatic on its own, but consistent enough that researchers kept paying attention. Now here's what's actually happening. Ginger contains bioactive compounds like gingerols and shogales. These compounds influence something called thermogenesis. That's the process where the body generates heat and burns energy while doing it. So instead of energy just being stored, a portion of it gets used up as heat. One controlled study observed an increase of roughly 40 calories burned per meal after ginger intake. That doesn't sound like much at first, but repeated across multiple meals, it becomes a steady background effect. Not visible day to day, but measurable over time. However, that's only part of the picture. Ginger also affects how food moves through the stomach. It speeds up gastric emptying, which means food doesn't sit and ferment as long. Less fermentation usually means less gas buildup and less internal pressure. That's where a lot of bloating actually starts. There's also an inflammatory component. Several studies have linked ginger intake to around a 20 to 30% decrease in gut inflammation markers under certain conditions. And that matters because inflammation doesn't just cause discomfort. It also changes how the body handles energy storage. When inflammation is high, the body tends to stay in a more conservative energy state, holding on to fuel instead of releasing it. When inflammation drops, that signal starts to relax. There's another layer worth mentioning. Ginger supports bile secretion, and bile is essential for breaking down dietary fats efficiently. So digestion becomes smoother, not just faster. But the key idea here isn't intensity. It's consistency. Ginger doesn't overhaul the system overnight. It slightly shifts how the system operates each day. And over time, those small shifts add up. So number 5 isn't a fat-burning trick. It's a metabolic adjustment signal. A small push toward higher activity inside the system. And the next compound goes even further because it starts interacting directly with blood sugar control at the source. Number 4. Cinnamon. Now this is where things start to feel a little more normal on the surface. But the biology underneath is anything but normal. Because most people use cinnamon like it's just a flavoring. Coffee, oatmeal, desserts. That's it. But in metabolic research, cinnamon shows up in a completely different category. It interacts with one of the most sensitive control systems in your body, blood sugar regulation. And here's why that matters. Every time your blood sugar rises too fast, your body has no choice but to respond. Insulin gets released immediately, but insulin isn't just a blood sugar helper. It's also a storage signal. It tells the body, Energy is available. Store it. Now that sounds harmless in isolation. But when this happens repeatedly throughout the day, the signal starts to dominate the system. And over time, the body becomes more biased toward storage behavior, especially around the abdomen. Now, in clinical observations on people with metabolic imbalance, cinnamon intake has been associated with improvements in fasting blood sugar control, commonly reported in the 10 to 17% range depending on duration and consistency. Again, not a cosmetic change, a shift in regulation. Now here's what cinnamon is actually doing inside the system. It contains active compounds such as cinnamaldehyde. And these compounds improve how cells respond to insulin signaling, meaning glucose is cleared from the bloodstream more efficiently, instead of lingering and triggering repeated insulin spikes. And when insulin spikes become smaller, the entire system becomes less reactive, more stable, less emergency mode. And that stability is critical, because unstable blood sugar is one of the hidden drivers of constant fat storage signaling. Now there's another layer happening underneath this. Cinnamon doesn't just affect glucose handling. It also influences how fat cells respond to energy signals. In cellular research, cinnamon compounds have been observed shifting fat cell behavior away from storage dominance toward more active energy processing activity, not forcing fat loss, but subtly changing the direction of metabolic signaling inside the cell. Now the gut connection matters too, because gut balance and metabolic control are deeply linked. And in microbiome studies, cinnamon has shown selective effects on bacteria, reducing certain harmful strains, while supporting beneficial ones like lactobacillus. When that balance improves, inflammatory pressure in the system tends to decrease, and that feeds back into better metabolic stability overall. But here's something important most people miss. Cinnamon is not just one thing. Cassia cinnamon, the common type, contains higher coumarin levels, which makes it less ideal for heavy daily use. Ceylon cinnamon contains much lower levels, which is why it's preferred in consistent long-term routines. Now step back for a moment. What cinnamon is really doing isn't forcing weight loss. It's stabilizing one of the most volatile systems in the body, blood sugar fluctuations. And when that volatility drops, everything downstream becomes easier to control. Less insulin overshooting, less storage signaling, more predictable metabolism. And that sets the stage for what comes next. Because the next compound doesn't just regulate internal balance. It starts physically moving through the digestive system and clearing what's been accumulating for years. Number 3. Turmeric. Now this is where most people start to misunderstand what's actually happening inside the body. Because this is not a digestion problem anymore. And it's not just a metabolism issue either. It's something deeper. A system-level signal that quietly controls how your body behaves every single day. Inflammation. And here's what makes it dangerous. Inflammation doesn't just happen. It sends instructions. And when those instructions stay active for too long, your body starts adapting to them. In clinical observations involving overweight adults, turmeric supplementation has been associated with measurable improvements in body composition markers over several weeks, including changes around the 8 to 9% range in some tracked outcomes. Not extreme, but consistent. And consistency is the part that matters here. Now here's where things start to connect. Visceral fat, the fat around your organs, is not passive. It behaves like an active signaling tissue. It releases inflammatory compounds into circulation. And those compounds don't just stay local. They spread through the system. And they reinforce the exact environment that created them. So the body gets stuck in a loop. More visceral fat, more inflammation. More inflammation, stronger fat storage signaling. And over time, that loop becomes self-sustaining. Even when diet improves. Even when activity increases. Now turmeric interrupts that loop. The active compound is curcumin. And curcumin doesn't act like a stimulant or a fat burner. It works at the signaling level, inside the inflammatory pathways that regulate cellular response. In multiple studies, curcumin has been associated with reductions in key inflammatory markers over time. And when those markers begin to drop, the system changes its behavior. The body no longer operates in a constant stress response state. Insulin sensitivity begins to improve. Stress signaling through cortisol becomes less dominant. And overall metabolic responsiveness starts to return. But that's only part of the picture. Because inflammation doesn't just affect fat storage. It affects the gut environment as well. And in controlled research, curcumin has been linked to improvements in gut microbial diversity. That matters because diversity is stability. Low diversity often means instability in digestion, energy regulation, and immune signaling. Higher diversity means the system becomes more predictable, less reactive, more balanced. There's also a structural layer here. Curcumin has been shown to support the integrity of the intestinal barrier, strengthening the tight junctions between gut cells. And when that barrier is stronger, less unwanted material crosses into the bloodstream, less immune activation, less background inflammation. But here's the part almost nobody gets right. Curcumin on its own is not efficiently absorbed. Most of it gets broken down before it ever fully enters circulation, which means the real limitation is not the compound itself. It's bioavailability. And in research settings, that's why curcumin is often paired with absorption enhancers that dramatically increase how much actually reaches the system. Because once absorption increases, the effects become significantly more noticeable. So number 3 is not about burning fat. It's about removing pressure from the system that keeps fat locked in place. It lowers the inflammatory load that silently drives storage behavior. And when that pressure starts to fade, the body stops resisting change at the same level. And that's when the next compound becomes important. Because it doesn't deal with signals anymore. It deals with physical cleanup of the digestive system itself. Number 2. Psyllium Husk. The internal gut sweep that most people completely underestimate. Now, this is where things start to feel very different. Because unlike herbs or spices, psyllium doesn't nourish anything first. It physically changes what's inside your digestive system. In clinical nutrition reviews analyzing multiple controlled trials, daily psyllium intake was associated with up to 80% improvement in bowel regularity symptoms and a measurable reduction in abdominal discomfort within just a few weeks. But that's only the surface effect. Let's go back to the case from earlier, the 66-year-old patient. Before any intervention, his colon wasn't just slow. It was described in imaging notes as showing significant stool retention and sluggish transit patterns, meaning waste was literally staying in the system far longer than normal. And that matters more than most people realize, because when waste movement slows down, fermentation increases, gas builds, inflammatory byproducts rise, and the gut environment gradually shifts toward bacteria that thrive in that low-movement state. Now here's where psyllium changes the entire equation. Once it enters the stomach and mixes with liquid, it expands into a gel structure, sometimes up to 20 times its original volume. But what's more important is what that gel does next. It doesn't just move through the gut. It collects material along the way. Think of it less like fiber, and more like a dynamic transport system that binds excess bile acids, undigested residue, and metabolic waste. One metabolic review from gut health research groups showed that soluble fiber intake like psyllium can support up to a 10 to 15% improvement in lipid elimination pathways, mainly through bile acid excretion. And that creates a ripple effect. Because when bile acids are removed more efficiently, the liver is forced to produce new ones. And that process uses cholesterol from circulation, which indirectly shifts how the body manages stored fat resources. But there's another layer that most people miss completely. Psyllium doesn't just affect waste removal. It changes microbial behavior. In a 2019 gut microbiome analysis, Soluble fiber supplementation was associated with increased production of short-chain fatty acids like butyrate by nearly 30 to 40% in some participants. And those compounds are not just gut fuel. They are signaling molecules that influence inflammation, gut lining integrity, and metabolic stability. Now bring this back to the real-world case. After introducing psyllium daily, something very specific happened. Transit time normalized. Bloating decreased significantly. And most importantly, the patient's follow-up notes showed marked improvement in stool consistency and frequency within the first 2 weeks. No new diet, no calorie changes, just a shift in internal mechanics. But here's the critical part. Psyllium is extremely powerful, but only when used correctly. Because without enough water, the same expansion effect that helps digestion can actually slow things down instead. That's why in clinical settings, it's always paired with high fluid intake to ensure proper gel movement through the intestines. So the real takeaway is not psyllium cleans your gut. It's something more precise. It rebuilds the movement system your digestive tract depends on to stay balanced. And once that system starts working again, everything else begins to respond differently too. Number 1, apple cider vinegar. The fat around your belly doesn't just accumulate. It responds to signals. And when those signals are off, nothing you do seems to fully fix it. Apple cider vinegar is usually treated like a simple health habit. But in metabolic science, it behaves more like a control signal. Something that subtly influences how your body decides what to do with the food you eat. Store it, or use it. And that distinction changes everything. Because most people still think belly fat is only about calories. Eat less. Move more. Stay consistent. Yet for many, the abdominal fat barely shifts, even after long periods of effort. So the real question becomes, what is not being addressed? A 2022 randomized controlled trial in Japan followed overweight adults for 12 weeks. No extreme dieting. No structured exercise intervention. Just daily intake of apple cider vinegar. What researchers observed was not random change. It was a consistent reduction in body weight, with a stronger effect specifically on visceral fat, the deep abdominal fat around internal organs. And that matters more than it sounds. Because visceral fat is not passive. It behaves like an active metabolic tissue. It releases inflammatory signals. It interacts with insulin pathways. It influences how the body partitions energy. So even small shifts here can create system-wide changes. Now the key compound involved is acetic acid. But it's important not to think of it as a fat-burning ingredient. That would be too simplistic. Instead, think of it as a metabolic bias modifier. Inside the liver and muscle tissue, it appears to influence how fuel is prioritized after eating. And metabolism always has 2 options. Use energy immediately or store it for later. In modern metabolic dysfunction, storage becomes dominant. What apple cider vinegar appears to do is slightly reduce that storage tendency. Not enough to override lifestyle, but enough to show measurable differences over time. And then there's the blood sugar connection. Multiple studies show that taking vinegar before carbohydrate-heavy meals can reduce post-meal glucose spikes in insulin-resistant individuals. And that matters because insulin is not just a blood sugar hormone. It is also a storage signal. Higher insulin spikes equals stronger fat storage bias, especially in the abdominal region. Lower spikes equals reduced storage pressure. That's the link most people never fully connect. There's also a digestive layer. Apple cider vinegar may slightly slow gastric emptying, not in a harmful way, but enough to extend satiety signals. Which is why some people notice reduced appetite and fewer cravings relatively quickly. Not because fat is disappearing, but because signaling is shifting. Then comes the gut environment. The mild acidity may influence microbial balance in the upper digestive tract, making it less favorable for certain overgrowth patterns while still supporting beneficial bacteria. And this is where early changes often show up first. Less bloating, less heaviness after meals, more stable digestion. Now here's where most people get it wrong. They increase the dose thinking faster is better. It doesn't work that way. In studied protocols, the standard approach is 1 tablespoon diluted in a full glass of water. Never undiluted due to acidity and enamel risk. And timing is critical. 15 to 20 minutes before the first meal of the day. Not after eating. Not randomly. Before food enters the system, when metabolic response is most adaptable. Some people need to start smaller, even 1 teaspoon, then gradually increase as tolerance builds. And the form matters too. Raw, unfiltered versions contain the mother, a fermentation culture that is often removed in processed versions. But zooming out, the key idea is this. Apple cider vinegar is not a standalone solution. It does not override lifestyle. It doesn't replace fundamentals. What it does is more subtle. It slightly shifts metabolic signaling in a way that becomes noticeable when the system is already moving in the right direction. And in most real cases, it's not the first change you feel, but it's often one of the final pieces that makes everything start responding again. So let's bring it all back together. 6 compounds. 1 system. Apple cider vinegar helps regulate metabolic response after eating. Psyllium husk clears waste and supports digestive function. Turmeric lowers inflammatory signaling that keeps fat locked in place. Cinnamon helps stabilize blood sugar and reduce storage pressure. Ginger supports digestion speed and metabolic activity. And flaxseed helps restore gut bacteria balance and internal gut function. But here's what actually matters. Not the list. Not the complexity. Execution. Because knowing this changes nothing until it becomes a daily pattern. Your body doesn't respond to information. It responds to repetition. Start small if you need to. 2 compounds. Maybe 3. Build consistency first. Optimization later. And let your system adjust over time, not overnight. Because the truth is simple. Your gut, your metabolism, your fat storage, they are always reacting to signals. So the real question isn't what you learned today. It's what signals you're going to send tomorrow. And if nothing changes in your routine, then nothing changes in your body. That's the system. And it only works when you do.